The Apache warrior collapsed, bleeding at her door, and she hid him from the law. The night had fallen quiet over the lonely stretch of land where her cabin stood, a hush so deep that even the wind seemed to step lightly, and she had just banked the fire low for sleep when a dull sound struck the door. Not a knock, but the weight of something heavy giving way. And when she opened it, a hand's width in fearful caution, she found the Apache warrior crumpled against the wooden boards, his dark hair tangled with sweat and dust, his breath torn and uneven, and a deep wound along his side soaking the earth beneath him with slow, relentless blood. She froze with the door half open, fear tightening her chest at the sight of his uniform of travel and battle, at the truth written in his fall that he had been running and could run no more. And for a long moment she did nothing but stare as the weight of the world's danger pressed into the small space between them, knowing that the law hunted his kind without mercy, knowing that anyone found sheltering him could lose everything they owned and more, knowing also that if she closed the door, he would be dead before sunrise. His fingers twitched faintly against the dirt, as if even in collapse he still reached for the land beneath him, and that small movement broke the spell that held her rooted, driving her back on instinct, even as her fear screamed for her to turn away. She looked once toward the dark line of the trees beyond her clearing, half expecting shapes to rise from it. Riders, lanterns, the glint of badges, and the certainty that danger was already pressing inward. But the night returned only silence. Lowering herself slowly, she touched his shoulder, feeling the heat of his skin and the tremor of pain running through him. And he stirred weakly, his eyes opening just enough to meet hers before sliding shut again, his lips moving without sound, as if a single word struggled to leave him and could not find the strength. Her hands shook as she tested the wound through his torn clothing, the wet warmth confirming what she already knew, that he was bleeding badly and long, and that time was already being stolen from him with every shallow breath. She pulled back sharply, panic rising again as the danger. She did not pull him inside yet, not at first, because the weight of what she was seeing held her frozen between fear and duty. And instead, she stood just beyond the threshold with the lantern trembling in her hand, casting weak yellow light over the shape of the Apache warrior, lying half in shadow, half in the spill of her doorway, his chest lifting and sinking with shallow effort, as though breathing itself had become a task too heavy for him to carry alone. And in that quiet moment, she saw not the stories the town told about men like him, but the raw truth of a body pushed past its limits. His face tightened in pain, his jaw clenched in stubborn resistance to the darkness pulling at him. And though every warning she had ever been taught rose in her mind, another voice, steadier and deeper than fear, asked what kind of person closed a door on death when it knelt just beyond the boards. She took a step closer, careful, watching for any sudden movement, and when he did not stir, she lowered herself a little more, close enough to hear the faint hitch in his breath and the quiet rasp in his lungs, and the sound stirred something old in her, a memory of sickness carried through long nights, of waiting and hoping and fearing that morning might never come. And without realizing it, she found herself speaking softly, not to him, but to calm the turmoil in her own chest, whispering that he was safe for this moment, at least, though she did not yet believe it herself. She glanced again toward the dark beyond the clearing, imagining riders where none stood, imagining the law already on his trail, imagining the questions they would ask if they found him here. And with that thought came the heavy truth that even being seen near him tied her fate to his, whether she wanted it or not. Her lantern light drifted across his torn clothing, the deep red stains spreading wider as the minutes slipped past, and the simple fact became unavoidable that standing and watching would finish what his pursuers had started. And though she had not yet chosen to save him, she knew she had already chosen not to let him die at her feet without her hands being stained by the choice. She reached cautiously for the edge of his coat and felt his body flinch faintly at the contact, not in threat, but in pain. And the sound he made then was not a growl or a warning, but something closer to the broken hush of a man fighting to remain awake, and that sound stripped away the last layer of distance between them, leaving only the reality of him and her in the thin pool of lantern light. Still, she did not move him, not yet, because another truth pressed hard against her resolve. That once she crossed the line of pulling him inside, there would be no turning back to the life she had known before this night. And so she lingered in that narrow space between fear and mercy, bearing witness to the cost of both. The choice, once made, moved faster than fear could chase it, and she set the lantern down hard on the floor just inside the doorway, its light spilling out across the threshold as she bent and slipped her arms beneath his shoulders, the weight of him shocking her with its solid truth. As she leaned back and pulled with all the strength her small frame could gather, his body dragging across the dirt with a low sound that made her wince, even as she gritted her teeth and pulled again, inch by inch, until his boots struck the wooden floor and his weight slumped fully into her cabin, bringing with it the sharp copper scent of blood and the stark reality that he was now hers to protect, whether she was ready or not. His head lolled against her shoulder as she dragged him farther inside, his breath breaking unevenly against her neck. And for a moment, fear surged again that he had slipped too far beyond her reach. But then his fingers caught weakly at her sleeve, as if even in fading strength he tried to anchor himself to something solid. And she spoke without thinking, her voice trembling but firm as she told him to stay with her, to keep breathing, to not let the dark take him just yet. She eased him down near the hearth where the stones still held a trace of warmth from the fire. She had banked for the night, his body sagging as the effort left him, and she fumbled to push the door closed with her foot, the sound of the latch sliding into place echoing through the small room like the closing of a gate behind her old life. She knelt beside him immediately, her hands moving with awkward urgency as she cut away the cloth around his wound, her fingers shaking at the sight of how deep the injury truly was, blood slow but steady as it traced along his side and soaked into the worn floorboards beneath him. He stirred faintly when the cool air touched the wound, his eyes opening just enough to find her face again. And when he tried to speak, the effort seemed to take more from him than his body could afford, and she leaned closer without hesitation, her ear near his lips as he whispered a single broken word that was not a threat or a demand, but a question shaped by pain and disbelief, asking if he was hidden now. She swallowed hard before answering, her own voice soft but clear as she told him that for this moment he was, that he was inside, and that the door was shut, and that he would not be alone tonight, even as the full weight of those promises pressed down on her heart. She worked quickly then, tearing strips from an old cloth to bind the wound as best she could, pressing hard despite his quiet groan, because she knew the bleeding had to slow, or there would be nothing left to save. And when her hands grew slick with his blood, she wiped them once against her skirt and pressed again, her jaw tight with effort and resolve. Outside, the night remained still, but inside her cabin, everything had changed with the simple act of pulling a hunted man across her threshold and locking the door behind him. And as she finished binding his wound and laid his head more gently against the floor, she realized that the rescue itself had been only the beginning of a far greater danger they now shared. The fire was coaxed back to life with careful hands and quiet breath, and as the first steady warmth returned to the room, she moved with single-minded focus between the hearth and the wounded man, setting water to heat, laying out the few clean cloths she owned, and working with a calm she did not feel, but forced into her body through will alone. For she knew that panic would only steal what little control she still had. He lay where she had drawn him, the rise and fall of his chest, uneven but present. And each time, his breath caught her own did the same. Yet she kept moving, kneeling beside him to cleanse the wound slowly. Her fingers gentle, despite the urgency of the task, as she rinsed away the blood with warm water and pressed fresh bindings into place, tightening them just enough to hold without stealing his breath again. The room filled with the smells of heat and damp cloth and faint iron from the lingering blood. And though the danger beyond her walls had not lessened, something inside the cabin softened as the fire crackled quietly and the cold of the night loosened its hold around them. She brought him a small cup of water when his lips grew dry and coaxed him to sip with a patience she had not known she possessed, whispering steady words, not for comfort alone, but to anchor him to listening and to living. And when he swallowed at last, his eyes fluttered open long enough for her to see the exhaustion buried behind the pain, the weariness of long pursuit and longer fear. She laid a thin blanket across his chest once the bleeding had slowed, tucking it close as if he were a child lost to the world rather than a warrior marked by the law. And when his body stilled beneath the warmth, not in danger, but in rest, the sight tugged something loose in her chest that she had held tight since opening the door. Only then did she allow herself to sit back on her heels, the tremor in her arms and legs finally free to show as the effort caught up to her, and she looked around her small cabin as if seeing it anew. The same rough table and worn chair and plain shelves that had once meant only loneliness now standing as a fragile shelter against a force far larger than either of them. She placed more wood on the fire and stirred a simple pot of broth from what little she had stored, knowing that strength would be needed before strength could return. And while it simmered, she remained near him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing grow steadier with each passing minute, the worst of the danger held at bay for now by warmth and stillness. Through the narrow window, the night remained dark and unbroken. But inside the cabin, there was no longer only fear, for rest had come quietly, wrapping both rescuer and rescued in a thin pause between pursuit and discovery. And though no future safety had been promised, for this single stretch of time, there was food on the hearth, warmth in the stones, and silence that did not threaten, and that was enough to keep hope breathing alongside them. She did not sleep that night, only drifted between watching and waiting as the fire burned low and steady. And when the first pale edge of morning pressed against the small window, the Apache warrior stirred for the first time with real movement instead of reflex, his breath deeper now, his body shifting with a low sound of discomfort that made her rise instantly from the chair where she had kept vigil. His eyes opened slowly as if waking itself required effort, and when they found her face, he stiffened in confusion before the pain reminded him where he was, and she lifted her hand in a small, calming gesture, speaking softly to tell him that he was still inside and that he had not been found. And though he did not yet have strength to sit, the tension in his shoulders eased slightly at her words. She brought him water again, and this time he drank on his own, carefully. And when she set the cup aside, he searched her face with quiet caution, not suspicion, but something gentler, as though trying to understand what kind of person would have pulled him across that threshold instead of closing the door. At last, he spoke more clearly than before, his voice low and measured despite the pain, asking why she had helped him when she knew what it would cost, and the question settled between them heavier than the night had been. She did not answer right away, only sat beside him on the floor and folded her hands to steady them, then told him in simple words that she had once been left alone in the dark herself, and that she would not be the one to turn away when another soul lay dying at her feet. And there was no pride in her voice, only quiet truth. He listened without interrupting, his gaze never leaving her, and when she finished, he closed his eyes briefly, as if the effort of holding himself together had grown heavier than the wound in his side. Then told her that he had been fleeing false charges tied to a traitor's death that he had not caused, that the law had listened only to fear and not to truth, and that once the hunt began, it did not easily stop. She absorbed his words slowly, not with surprise, but with the steady weight of reality. And though fear stirred again in her chest, it did not chase him from her sight as it might have before this night. When she asked his name, he gave it simply, and she offered hers in return, and in that exchange something small but lasting took root between them, a recognition that each was more than the danger surrounding them. She told him the law would search soon, and that hiding him would place a shadow over her home, and he answered that he would leave once he could stand, so that her life would not be unraveled by his presence. But she surprised both of them by answering that a man could not walk with blood still fresh in his body, and that no one left her cabin until they were strong enough to do so safely. The words hung there, firm and unyielding, and he nodded once in quiet acceptance, the first true sign of trust passing between them, as the fragile bond of shared risk took hold. The sound reached her first as a distant change in the morning air, not a clear noise, but a disturbance in the quiet that made her lift her head sharply from the table where she had been preparing more water, and moments later it came again, more defined. The faint rhythm of hooves carried across the open land in steady measure, slow enough to suggest searching rather than passing. And the moment her ears confirmed it, her heart tightened with the knowledge she had been holding back since the rescue, that the law would not take long to follow a wounded man's trail. She crossed to the narrow window and peered through a thin gap beside the shutter, seeing at the far edge of her clearing 3 riders moving in a wide fan through the grass with the deliberate patience of men who expected to find what they sought, the dull shine of authority at their chests catching the early light, and she felt the weight of her choice settle more firmly upon her shoulders. Behind her, the Apache warrior stirred weakly at the tension that shifted in her body, and she turned back to him quickly, lowering her voice, though he could already read the answer in her face, telling him that the law had come closer than she had hoped, and when he tried to push himself up on one arm, she pressed him gently but firmly back against the floor, reminding him that his strength was not yet his own again. His jaw tightened with frustration that held no anger toward her, only the helplessness of a man used to moving under his own will, and he told her that he would not let her suffer for his escape, that he would meet them if he had to. But she answered with a quiet steadiness that the moment for that decision had not yet arrived, and that haste would only hand him back to those who had already decided he was guilty. She moved quickly then, guided by instinct more than thought, drawing him farther from the main room behind the hanging blanket that screened a narrow storage space, arranging tools and sacks before the opening in a way that would look natural to anyone who did not already know what lay beyond it. And when she finished, she wiped her hands once against her skirt and stood still to calm the tremor in her breath. The riders' voices grew faintly audible outside, carried in broken fragments by the shifting breeze, not shouting, but calling to one another in the dull tones of men accustomed to pursuit. And she felt the dangerous closeness of discovery press inward until every creak of her cabin and every breath she drew seemed too loud. A heavy knock sounded at her door, then, firm and without doubt, and she answered it after a single steadying breath, lifting the latch and opening to the sight of the sheriff seated on his horse, with 2 deputies flanking him, their eyes already searching past her into the shadowed space behind. The sheriff spoke calmly, asking if she had seen a wounded Apache pass through in the night, and the words struck at the center of her fear. Yet she met his gaze with quiet composure and answered that she had heard nothing but the wind and the owls, that no one had crossed her land since sundown. His eyes lingered on her face as if measuring truth by weight alone, and one of the deputies shifted in his saddle as though eager for the search to begin. But after a long moment, the sheriff tipped his hat slightly and said they would continue on, warning her to report if she saw anything. And as their horses turned and the sound of their departure slowly faded back into the land, she closed the door and leaned against it with her eyes shut, knowing the danger had not passed, but only drawn its first close circle around their fragile shelter. The silence that followed the departure of the law felt heavier than the danger itself, settling into every corner of the cabin as she moved back to the hidden space where the Apache warrior lay. And when she drew aside the hanging cloth and met his watchful eyes, the strain she had been holding inside her chest finally surfaced in the tight set of her jaw and the tremor beneath her calm. He read the conflict in her face without needing words, understanding that the danger had crossed a line from distant threat to living presence. And though pain still guarded his movements, he shifted slightly, as if preparing himself for the choice he already sensed was growing inevitable. She knelt beside him and told him the sheriff had come to her door, that his men were close enough to smell smoke and listen for breath. And though she had sent them away for now, the land itself had already learned the shape of the hunt, and there would be no long hiding once the trail was searched again. He closed his eyes briefly as the truth settled deeper than the wound in his side, and when he opened them again, his voice was steady, though quiet, as he told her she must not risk everything she had built for a man the law had marked, that she should send him away the moment he could stand, even if it meant the wilderness would decide the rest. The words were spoken not in bitterness, but with the weight of honor shaped by loss, and they struck her harder than any threat the sheriff could have delivered, because they forced her to face the truth she had been avoiding since the rescue, that mercy carried a cost, and she was now standing at the place where she must decide how far she would follow it. She turned away from him for a moment, staring at the hearth where the last of the morning fire had burned down to low embers. And in that quiet stretch, she felt the old ache of solitude she had endured before this night, the long seasons of tending her home without witness, the steady fear of illness or injury with no one near enough to hear. And she realized with a sudden clarity that sending him away now would not restore her former peace, but only return her to a loneliness made sharper by the brief passing of human trust. She faced him again and told him she did not know how to weigh a stranger's life against her own safety. But she did know what kind of person she would become if she closed the door now after already choosing to open it, and the admission left her voice quiet and bare between them. He studied her for a long moment, not as a hunted man judging his shelter, but as one human soul measuring the courage of another, and at last he lowered his gaze in acceptance, saying only that if suffering followed her choice, he would carry its burden with her as long as he had breath. The words did not ease her fear, but they steadied it. And in that fragile balance, she understood that the greatest danger before her was no longer the law outside her door, but the decision forming inside her heart about who she would remain when safety and mercy could no longer walk the same path. The riders returned before sunset, as she had feared they would, this time not with the drifting search of uncertainty, but with the tightened purpose of men who believed they were close to their prize. And she felt the first distant thud of hooves in her bones before her ears fully named the sound, her body reacting with a quiet readiness that surprised her with its steadiness as she moved to the window and confirmed what her heart already knew. The Apache warrior tried to rise when she told him what was coming, bracing one hand against the floor despite the weakness that still betrayed him. But she pressed him back with both palms firm against his chest and told him that this time running would not save either of them, that the land was too open and his strength not yet enough. And when he looked at her with a question that bordered on apology, she answered it without words by lifting his broken rifle from where it rested near the wall and sliding it farther out of reach, the act quiet and deliberate, sealing her decision even as her hands trembled. She pulled the hanging cloth fully into place again and arranged the storage sacks more carefully than before, then turned toward the door with a calm that did not belong to fear anymore, but to resolve, knowing that once she opened it, the last fragile distance between danger and truth would be erased. The knock came sharp and impatient this time, and when she opened the door, the sheriff stood closer than before, his eyes harder, the deputies already dismounting behind him without waiting for invitation. And he spoke plainly that the trail had ended at her land and that they would search her cabin whether she consented or not. For a heartbeat, the temptation to step aside rose like a whisper of escape, but she held her place in the doorway and told him that no man entered her home without cause or warrant, her voice steady, though her heart beat so loudly she feared it would carry through the boards. The sheriff studied her, then not as a lone woman on isolated land, but as an obstacle unexpectedly firm, and when he gestured for his men to wait, frustration showed briefly beneath his authority as he warned her that sheltering a fugitive would cost her the land she stood on, and possibly her freedom as well. She answered him not with defiance, but with truth, saying that she had offered food and water to no one but a dying man, and that if the law now chose to make that a crime, then it would have to name mercy as outlawed before the whole town. And the words carried more weight than she had intended, striking at something beyond her alone. Behind her, the Apache warrior listened through pain and shadow, understanding without sight that she was placing her home, her name, and her future into the space between herself and the law. And when one of the deputies shifted forward with growing impatience, he pushed himself upright despite the cost, the effort drawing a sharp breath from his lungs as he stepped into view behind her, wounded but standing, his presence sudden and undeniable. The standoff broke in that moment, not by force, but by witness. The law faced with the living truth they claimed to hunt, and the woman who had chosen to stand unarmed before them as shield. And in that fragile turning point, she felt fear give way fully to courage, knowing that whatever followed would now be shaped by the sacrifice she had made in plain sight. The air between them held tight as a drawn breath. The wounded Apache warrior standing unsteadily behind her, with one hand braced against the wall, his strength borrowed from will alone, while the sheriff and his deputies faced him in open sight for the first time since the hunt began. And in that fragile stillness, every lie that had fed the pursuit seemed suddenly too thin to hold its shape. The sheriff's gaze moved from the blood-darkened bandages at the man's side to the woman standing before him without weapon or hiding, and something in her quiet defiance unsettled the certainty he had carried to her door, enough that his hand did not rise to signal his men forward. The Apache spoke then, his voice low but steady, telling of the traitor whose death had lit the fire of false accusation, of the struggle on the riverbank when the man had drawn a blade first in greed and fear, of how the wound he carried had been earned not in murder, but in survival. And as he spoke, he did not speak in anger, but in truth, stripped to its core, laying each word before them like evidence that could no longer be ignored. One of the deputies shifted uneasily as recognition flickered across his face, and he admitted under his breath that the traitor had a history of violence that had been quietly set aside because he wore the protection of trade and paper. And the admission cracked the rigid shape of the charge that had driven the pursuit across open land and into this small clearing. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he listened, his authority tested not by force, but by the public weight of truth now spoken without shadow. And after a long moment, he turned to his men and ordered them to lower their weapons and step back, the command carrying both reluctance and resolve as he accepted what could no longer be denied. He faced the woman again and told her that hiding a wounded man from a lawful search was no small risk. Yet the law did not stand above truth, and where truth had been wronged, the law must bend or become the very injustice it claimed to oppose. The Apache warrior swayed slightly as the burden of conflict lifted from him, and she moved instinctively to steady him, her hand firm at his arm without hesitation or fear, and in that simple act, their shared trial became visible not as secrecy, but as unity shaped by choice. The deputies mounted their horses again without triumph or threat, the purpose of their ride unmade by the truth they now carried back toward town, and when the sheriff tipped his hat in parting, it was not in warning, but in acknowledgement of a line drawn and held. As the riders departed for the final time, the clearing returned to quiet, not as fragile pause, but as earned release, and she guided the Apache warrior back inside with care, now free of disguise, the door closing not on fear, but on the last echo of pursuit. She told him quietly that he was no longer hunted and that the land would not rise against him again, and though exhaustion pulled at his frame, relief softened his voice as he thanked her, not only for hiding him, but for standing when strength alone would not have been enough. In that shared understanding, justice took its place not as victory over an enemy, but as the restoration of a man's name and a woman's courage made whole in the open light of truth. The quiet that followed the truth felt different from the quiet that had come before it, no longer tense with hiding, but open and steady as the evening light settled across the clearing and softened the edges of the small cabin that had borne more weight than it was built to hold. And as she guided him back inside for the last time, without fear of hooves or badges at the door, the Apache warrior moved with slow care, his wounds still healing, but his steps no longer shaped by urgency alone. She built the fire again, with an ease that surprised her, not because the danger had vanished entirely from the land, but because it had finally loosened its grip on her home. And when he sat near the hearth this time, his posture was no longer that of a man waiting to flee, but of one allowed to remain, even if only for the length of a single evening. They spoke little at first, not from distance, but from the deep tiredness that follows struggle. And in that shared stillness, she brought him food once more, watching him eat with a gratitude that did not rush him or demand anything beyond the simple miracle of seeing him nourished instead of hunted. He told her that the clearing of his name would allow him to return to his people when his strength returned, not as a shadow slipping through the edges of the world, but as a man who could walk in daylight again. And though the thought of his leaving stirred something unspoken in her chest, she met it without sorrow, understanding that peace did not always mean keeping what one had protected, but releasing it when the time was right. She told him that the land would remain open to him if he ever passed this way again, and he answered that no place that held both danger and mercy in the same walls could ever be forgotten, and in that exchange there was no promise that needed shaping, only respect made steady by truth. As the night deepened, the fire cast warm light over the room that had twice been tested by fear and had now been shaped by courage, and she realized that her cabin no longer felt like a place she merely survived within, but a home that carried a story greater than her own solitude. When he rose carefully to rest, she saw in his movements not weakness, but patience, and she understood that healing did not demand haste when it had already been won by choice rather than force. When morning came, it came quietly, and with it the simple tasks of water drawn and fire tended, life returning to its ordinary rhythm without erasing what had been changed beneath it. And in that steady return, she felt the shape of her future settle into something wider than it had been before, not defined by fear of what might come to her door, but by the knowledge of what she would choose to do if it ever did. As the sun lifted over the clearing and painted the land gold without spectacle, she understood that purpose had not arrived in thunder or triumph, but in the quiet certainty that mercy, once chosen, did not shrink the world but expanded it, leaving her standing not in loneliness, reclaimed, but in peace, earned. Sometimes doing what is right costs more than safety ever could. Thank you for walking this quiet road of courage with us. May your own choices lead you home in peace.